Well, this is the first time we've ever been on time for one of these things, I think, actually. It's usually like fashionably late by a minute, but we're not today. So, welcome everyone to ProductTank Exeter. Should we do quick intros, actually? Because people might not know who we are.
It's fair.
Tor, do you want to go first?
Okay. Okay, hi, I'm Tor. I am head of product at Miro for their developer platform. And I was one of the handful of people who originally kicked off ProductTank Exeter. What would it be now? 2 years ago, pretty much?
I think it's coming up on 3, actually.
Coming up on 3 years ago.
3 years.
Okay. However, I no longer live in Exeter, which is ironic. But I'm still. They still let me join very kindly. And with that, I'll hand off to Hannah.
I'm Hannah. I'm a product manager at a company called Lightfoot, which essentially gamifies efficient driving. So it reduces emissions and lots of other good stuff. I've been with ProductTank Exeter the least time of everyone else. I joined just before the first lockdown in the UK, which meant that I was all excited to join for the in-person events and host those. And immediately we were online, which has had its benefits because it's meant we've been able to talk to some much more interesting people, not more interesting people, but much wider group of interesting people, as well as our local crew. But that's it. I'll hand back to you, Dave.
Cool. Yeah, sorry, I should have said I absolutely did not say we were going to do this, but I just suddenly thought actually maybe we'll just basis that nobody knows. So my name's Dave. I work as a PM at Utility Warehouse, or UW for short. It's a multi-service utility provider in the UK, and I look after a fintech product for them. And I was, with Tor, helped set up ProductTank Exeter, and we're excited to do this event tonight. So. Without further ado, shall we do the intro slides for those who don't know much about ProductTank? Do you want to click on Hannah? Awesome. So ProductTank is an umbrella brand for the world's largest product community, as it says there. It was started originally about just over 10 years ago by a group of people in London who were tired of not having anyone else to sort of talk and moan about product stuff with, so got together in a pub, and 10 years later this is the result. There's product management people moaning all over the world. So that's really cool. We started this chapter down in Exeter about 3 years ago, as Hannah said, and the idea is that there should be a local product community all over the place, anywhere where product people are, so that you can connect and talk about product stuff, commiserate, share ideas, tips, build your network. And linked to that then is Mind the Product, which is a conference and events business that puts on really good conferences and training for product managers. And as they say there, the mission is to make product people more successful by coming together to further our craft, which is great. We love when people get involved. So if you are watching and you would like to come and speak at ProductTank, that would be awesome. We would love you to come and speak down in Exeter. For those who don't know, Exeter is down on the south coast of England, southwest coast of England. But you could also get involved by looking to start your own ProductTank. If there are product people around you and there's no community, you could serve them by setting up a ProductTank chapter, or come and write for Mind the Product. They're always looking for good content and good articles of people's product experience. And then lastly, if you want to, Mind the Product has got a sponsorship, a membership program. You can join and get really interesting regular content on product management delivered straight to your inbox. And there's a community as well. So there's loads of ways to get involved. Would strongly encourage you to look at those different things. And if you've got questions about them, ask us. We'd be happy to point you in the right direction. Tonight, we are very grateful to Nexus Mods for sponsoring. If you haven't heard of Nexus Mods, don't worry, because I hadn't either. For those who've been around ProductTank Exeter for a while, Ben, one of the original co-founders, is a product guy over there. And Nexus Mods is the world's largest gaming modding site, used over by over 28 million users on a monthly basis. It's one of those absolutely huge businesses that, unless you know it, you might not have heard of it. Kind of flies under the radar, but they are based in Exeter and they are hiring for a PM. So if you are interested in any way in gaming, in community platforms, and they have their own tool that they use to help develop stuff, gaming tool, go and check out that link for the PM role that they're hiring. I think it's the first proper PM role there. So a really interesting opportunity, and obviously a great one if you are watching us from Exeter or even further afield. I think they are open to some remote stuff as well. So thanks to them, and go and check that out. Cool. I'm doing a lot of talking. Don't worry, it's not going to be like that all evening. But we are delighted, as you will, I'm sure, be aware because you're here, not to listen to me, that tonight we are joined by Dan Chu, who is the Chief Product Officer at Waymo. I'm sure most people have heard of Waymo, but I'm not going to try and introduce that in my own words. So Dan, do you want to say hello and just give a very quick intro to yourself and Waymo?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, so maybe the quickest intro to Waymo is we're an autonomous technology company, and our mission is to make it safe and easy for people and things to get where they want to go. And so we're really focused on L4 autonomous technology. And so I am the Chief Product Officer there. So I oversee the product management, UX research, technical program management, and strategy elements for Waymo. So glad to be here.
Fantastic. And one thing we did want to really plug before is it's not just going to be us asking questions. We would love your questions as well. So the way we're going to do that, primarily, if possible, is if you go to Slido, that's sli.do, and then on the home screen, you'll see a big thing asking you to enter an event code. If you use PTX, short for ProductTank Exeter, enter that and you'll be able to see all the questions that are coming in, add your own. You can vote on questions that you really like the look of and you want Dan to answer, and we'll be curating those and asking those throughout the evening as well. So please do go in and ask your questions. It will make the event much more fun than just listening to us. So without further ado, I'm going to remove this and let's get started. So Dan, thanks for joining us. How did you end up at Waymo? What's your career been like to date? Do you want to just give us a short potted history?
Oh, does it have to be short? So I'll try to make it short, but I would say that it probably starts all the way kind of when I was looking for undergrad, and I was one of those folks that was very interested both in technology and finance. But each time I think I've had an opening in my career, I think the market has also fed into my decision making. So like when I came out of school, it was during the dot-com boom, at the risk of dating myself. And so I felt like, hey, I had to go into tech, right? Like it was, all the rage to go into a startup. So I felt like that was the opportunity. I also felt like I had to go into software engineering because it's hard to go like less technical. So I started in software engineering, did 3 startups in Silicon Valley, mostly focused on SaaS as a business because I felt I didn't get the consumer eyeball bit. I thought enterprise made more sense. But after 3 startups, I took a step back and was feeling like, hey, what's the impact that I want at the end of my career? And it felt like enterprise software wasn't going to be the impact that I wanted to leave. And so I decided to volunteer with a number of startups, or nonprofits, actually. So I worked with a nonprofit, it's called the Benetech Initiative, and they do technology for social good. So for instance, audio book sharing for the blind, landmine detection technology. And I worked on a project trying to create a tool to allow better human rights violation reporting for NGOs on a global basis, because it's often a paper-based process, so it makes it very easy to get confiscated. Worked on United Way of America, where we looked at how can we make philanthropy more efficient using technology. So worked on nonprofits like that, and then decided to go to grad school. So I went to get a joint degree between a public policy degree and an MBA. So spent 3 years over the course of that, and was really looking for a way to have social impact as part of my career. So I spent, for instance, my first internship in Kenya, working for a nonprofit called TechnoServe, looking for applications of technology in developing countries that really helped economic development. So we really focused, for instance, on mobile payments in Kenya, and they had the M-Pesa technology. And then the next summer, some would say it was a kind of a big flip, but I spent it in investment banking because I was still interested in finance and was thought, if clean tech financing could be a way where I could combine social impact along with my interest in financing. But once again, the markets kind of had a say in terms of what I did when I came out. So I graduated in the midst of the financial crisis. And so I was looking at my investment banking offer and I was like, it's already kind of a miserable life. And plus, like, there's going to be no deal flow. Do I really want to do that? But I went into grad school adamant that I didn't want to do tech anymore. I actually went in saying, there's just no way that tech has at its core social impact. It always feels like window dressing. And so I wanted to do something different. So I didn't apply to a single tech company. My wife will take credit for having saved my career because she secretly applied to Google for me without telling me because she knew I was nuts. And so I suddenly got a phone call saying, hey, you've got an interview with Google for a product management position. I was like, and at that time, I wasn't really sure what product management was. But I was like, well, I've got either this, financial crisis job or nothing else. So I better take the call. So I had the interview, got the job, and felt like I was going to just hide out at Google for a year while the financial crisis blew over, and then I would find a real job. But then I fell in love with product management, really, and that's kind of where I met Tor. Was working on product management in their Google Maps, working on the development platform. As part of that, moved to Australia, got to know Tor and other folks, and really just love the craft, right? Like, it just felt like such an amazing combination. I know I'm preaching to the choir here of like technology, business, strategy all together, like just enough tech, but not like semicolon tech, right? Like, you get exactly kind of what you wanted. So I spent several years in Google Maps. And then at some point realized that, for my next step in my career, probably need to come back to the mothership at Google, and was looking around for different opportunities. And that's when the Waymo offer came up as an opportunity. And I would say that many folks kind of advised me not to take the offer because Waymo was pretty nascent at the time. They really didn't have a product management team. And so it was primarily kind of more engineering driven. And so folks are like, don't go there. They don't know what product managers do, right? I don't know if any of you have had the similar experience, right? But it just felt too interesting to pass up, right? So I actually went from kind of managing product managers to being an individual contributor. But the thought of being able to deliver on a product that when we deliver it, will save 1.35 million lives every single year. That's the number of lives that are lost on the roads every year. And that's not even counting the injuries. Just felt too compelling to pass up. So I took the opportunity at Waymo, and it's been an amazing ride. But I would say that it's been a lot of learning around how do you build a product organization from scratch? How do you create value in terms of a product organization? But that's my not so short story of how I ended up as Chief Product Officer at Waymo.
No, that's fantastic and hugely helpful. I just wanted to quickly before this is off program, but quickly, you said that those guys don't know how to do product at Waymo. That was the reputation. Sort of, why was that? What was it about Waymo that meant that there wasn't a product organization, and what does it look like to build one there?
Well, I think it's not an unusual situation, right, for technology companies to have started primarily from an engineering organization, right? And so there really were hardly any. I think when I joined, there was like one or two product managers. And what I think often happens is you put the product managers on the user-facing stuff, right, not on the other elements, right? And so when I joined, you would have, I think, a product manager on the mobile app, and on the user experience in terms of the vehicle, but that was it, right? So I think that was kind of the situation where like the vast majority of the engineering organization didn't have any product coverage. And they were also, if you look at especially the folks that we hire, like a lot of them do come from academia, right? Like PhDs and robotics and elsewhere. So there's even less exposure to what product management does. So I think you have those two elements that come together. And so it was very nascent of a product organization, but then also the engineering organization was less experienced with what product management brings to the table.
So we've got questions coming through about Waymo and kind of autonomous driving in general, but I think what would be great to start with is for you to give some context in terms of what Waymo has delivered so far. What have you guys been up to? Where have you got to? And just a little bit of background on that.
Absolutely, yeah, sure. So Waymo's been at this for quite a while, actually. So over 10 years, we've been working at this craft of building autonomous technology. We started early on, actually focused on what we call L2. So initially started kind of more as a driver assistance product on highways, until we quickly realized, one, that wasn't going to achieve the mobility transformation that we wanted to, because that only to assist you right in turn times. But the other problem we realized was just it's very hard for humans to stay engaged when the car kind of drives itself most of the time or some of the time. And so that's really when we pivoted to what we call L4 technology, which will take the car from the origin to the destination with no interaction required by the passenger. And so we developed, at this point, what we've been able to do is we've actually launched a ride-hailing service in the Phoenix area, call it Waymo One. So anyone can download the mobile app and instantaneously take a ride from one place to another. And there's no autonomous specialist in the car. You have the car to yourself. And so that's what we've been able to achieve so far. And our goal really is to extend that into other areas. So for instance, we're also taking that same Waymo driver, which is kind of that core technology, and applying it to long haul trucking, which is another area that I think is a really useful application for technology. And then we're looking at other areas as well. But I would say those are our primary two. We also look at delivery, local delivery, and then eventually in terms of other applications. But those are the two primary ones. So that's kind of what we've been able to achieve, is we have that live service that runs every single day.
I'm curious, you mentioned that there was a decision that was made at an early stage to switch focus from L2 to L4. That doesn't sound like an easy decision to make, or like a trivial decision to make. As product managers, we're often thinking in terms of, okay, what's the MVP here? And so to go straight to, actually, let's tackle an incredibly hard problem that nobody has solved yet and we don't even know is possible, seems quite brave, if a little out of character almost for many product managers. So I'm curious as to kind of what drove that decision and how you were able to build consensus for such a kind of aggressive change of direction.
Well, one, I want to start with saying it did predate me a bit, so I can't take any credit or blame for the decision. But having kind of been close to that process, I would say there's a couple contributors to that. One is part of what the genesis or the trigger for that conversation was really our user research. So what we had done with the L2 prototype was then move to what we often call like a fish food or dog food program within Google, right? And we had the user research team do a lot of hands-on work to make sure that we were understanding how the riders and Googlers were interacting with it. And that's when we realized we were seeing, even after reminding them, this is a prototype, right? Please, keep focus. And there's a camera in the car, right? We saw time and time again, folks being distracted, right? People fumbling for their charger in their backpack, people, putting makeup during their commute. And I think that was one of the biggest triggers, was just a realization that it doesn't matter how much you remind people, no matter how, that's a pretty extreme situation, right? It's a prototype, you have a camera, it, and yet the human is just there's a attraction to basically being distracted. So I think that was a huge data point, and so I think that was a big part of the decision. I think the other part of the decision was, and I think this is part of the magic of Google and Alphabet, right? Is this sense of how can we focus on the real game changers? And the feeling was L2 technology would be great, but it would be incremental, right? And it wouldn't achieve, for instance, the benefits of accessibility that we'd love, right? Like, we partnered, for instance, with organizations and great friends where we know that there's millions of Americans and globally, right, like of folks that aren't able to get a driver's license. And so I think it was kind of that combination was having the data that really showed us that distraction was almost inevitable. And we've unfortunately seen that as an outcome in terms of some of the L2 deployments. And then the second one was really wanting to get to that product that had that transformational impact.
You mentioned in there about kind of trying to achieve mobility transformation. What I guess some of that big strategy decision has to link to why Waymo exists. And I'd be interested to sort of, if you could share that in your own words, like why Waymo exists, and also then sort of why Google, like why is Google involved in this? How does that connect to Google's mission?
Yeah. So I think if we look at the genesis of Waymo, I think it's a strong belief that we look at something like traffic deaths or car crash deaths, and I think as a society we've almost become accustomed to it, right? So for instance, if we hear like that there is traffic and it was due to a fatal accident or a crash, we think, oh, that'll take longer for the traffic to clear, right? Like I think we're almost become programmed to like feel like car crashes, car deaths, and injuries are just a part of life. And I think part of the genesis for Waymo was like, that's kind of crazy, right? Like it's one of the top 10 causes of death on a global basis. And yet, we focus much more on other areas. And so I think the hope there was when Waymo started, I think the feeling of a fully autonomous car was seen as nuts, right? It was like just craziness. And so unless Waymo went forward, nobody was going to do it, right? Everyone we talked to was like, this is decades out. There's no way this can happen. So I think that's part of the genesis, was feeling like there's a societal problem that needs to get addressed. And secondly, nobody was going to do it, right? It just felt like too nuts to do it. To your question of why at Google, I think the other realization was, even though it's often kind of deployed within a vehicle, it's really fundamentally at its core a software problem, right? And understanding machine learning, artificial intelligence, all those elements, I think that was something like Larry and Sergey saw early on as it's actually very natural that Google would tackle it, right? Because we've got, amazing infrastructure, we've got amazing folks that can tackle that core problem. And so I think that's why it really made sense and has been a great home for Waymo to be part of that Alphabet family.
We've had some questions coming through on the Slido, which are being upvoted, which is great. So we're finding out which ones people are desperate to ask. So one that's come up here is they'd be really interested to hear about the steps Waymo went through in the product organization as they built it. So I'm thinking, if you're nodding away, are you happy with that one already?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll just share kind of my experience through it. We'll see kind of, in the future, if I ever build a product org again, like what would be the same steps. But I think for me, what we experienced early on, right, is because the org is not used to a product management organization, you have to kind of teach it and show value, right? And so I think there are a couple elements that were critical to that. One is actually you have to hire the right folks, because let's be honest, right? Like some of us in the product org, like we call ourselves mini CEOs, like we have certain perspectives on ourselves, right? And I think we needed to make sure that we brought in folks that were willing to kind of win a seat at the table. And I think it's true that a lot of product managers, if you gave them that job, they'd be like, I'm out of here. Like I'm not gonna re-earn my seat at the table. And so we needed to find a particular type of product manager that brought in a lot of technical depth, yet, really wasn't worried about, hey, they need to be asking for the PRD every other day, right? Rather than me kind of getting myself in the conversation. So I think one element was the hiring bit. the technical depth, I think, was critical, right? Because as you're trying to build credibility for a product organization, like the first misstep, right, for a product organization is one that the engineering team can poke technical holes in, right? Is seen as and so that was another critical element. I think the third one was to go a little more senior in terms of our initial hires, right? Like that we needed to bring in folks that had experience, that they weren't learning the ropes. So I think hiring was a critical element. And I think the second element was, I'll be honest, I think it was around do whatever it takes to add value, right? So were meeting notes taken. There was like kind of more programmatic, like kind of tools or work streams. And basically we wanted to be that anytime you engage with a product manager, you would go faster. And that was kind of like the brand that we wanted to have as a product organization across Waymo. And so, and then that way you're not pushing a product manager, right? Saying like, hey, you need a product manager there, you need coverage. You got this kind of growing ask for product managers. So it's like, oh, wow, I saw like what happened when Bob was working on that, or can I get Sue over here? And that's kind of like the effect that we wanted to have to start building the product org. And then I think then the next step there is once you're in the, at the table, then you have to start adjusting how you add value, right? And that was the next phase, right? Is like, now we're in the door, everyone wants a product manager. Now you have to say like, yeah, actually we don't just get the coffee, right? Like we do other things too. And start getting involved in setting requirements and setting the roadmap. But I think it was still more kind of incremental at the time, right? Like we were not establishing like a multi-year roadmap and saying, hey, here it is. It was more kind of incremental. And I think it was still a mix of program management tasks. And then I think the last phase is when you fully mature, right, into a product org where you really focus on, and people understand what it delivers. People focus on the requirements and the roadmap and the prioritization that you offer. And I think that's also when you can start shifting the hiring. So you can do kind of more of a spectrum of junior and senior folks. You can get more of a mix of backgrounds. But that's kind of like the three phases that I feel like we went through that were critical in terms of going from, I don't even know what a product manager does other than ask me a million questions about the future that I can't answer now, to, oh my gosh, this is a really critical organization and we need to partner with them.
So I'm curious, building on that, given that you spent a good amount of time on Maps, which is a more, in a sense, a more traditional software product, and I know you were also involved on the enterprise side, so there was sort of that B2B component to it as well, and so forth. So how is product management at Waymo? Kind of what aspects about it are kind of shared with or common to product management more broadly, and then what aspects of it are kind of more unique to either Waymo specifically or the space that you're in?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the unique areas. Coming from Google Maps or Google, I would say there are definitely some differences. One is just in terms of it's much more of a hardware software integrated product, right? And so, and I think there's just a lot of complexity, right? In terms of autonomous technology, there's just, even within the tech components, there's just a lot. And so if you think about it, there's almost like the core Waymo driver elements. There's some of the the sensor elements, the vehicle elements, and then more of the user facing elements. And so I think that's one difference, was just, at least in my personal experience, just the complexity and how much it cut across different almost types of product management, right? Hardware, software, user-facing, infrastructural. And so I think that's one difference. I think the other difference is, especially when you're at like a large tech company like a Google, you're very used to some of the tools of experimentation, right? Being able to run a 1% experiment across all the developers and get feedback on that. That's, especially in autonomous technology, that's just not a tool. We don't have the scale to have that 1% experiment. So I think that puts a a bigger onus, one, on the product management craft, right? Because you actually have to have the product intuition to make the right prioritization decisions and features and elements. It's also led to a much bigger emphasis on user research within Waymo. So we've had that very early on as an important discipline within Waymo, because that gives us both the qualitative and quantitative information that we want to make decisions on. So I think those are some of the differences. And maybe the other difference is I do think that there's probably been even more of a, like, I know this is not true of every company, but at least at Google, there was more of an emphasis on the general athlete in terms of a product manager, like somebody who could just, we're not looking for an expert on, LiDAR or anything else like that. We're just looking for somebody who's really good at product. I would say that at Waymo, we've actually, especially as we've grown, we have looked for more expertise, because I think it is easier when you have both that technical credibility and detail. And because of the complexity, you just don't have the time for somebody to be kind of a generalist and then go get up to speed. So we do have more of a preference, I think, for expertise. So I think those are some of the differences. In terms of some of the commonalities, right, especially as we've matured as an organization, I think it is around, creating PRDs, around, setting, helping shape the OKRs and the goals for the organization. It is around creating the roadmaps for the organization. So I think those are common tasks that I would say that is true at Waymo in terms of its more mature product state, as is true of other product organizations.
And just actually, something you mentioned there connects to one of the questions that's come in. Would you say that, given that you mentioned that you're now perhaps you are looking more for people with specific domain experience that might be relevant, does that mean that what you were saying earlier about tending to hire more senior people continues to be true? Because one of the questions that came in was around sort of what are the skills that you look for in entry-level PMs, but I'm curious whether that's something that you even have. Do you have entry-level PMs, or is it more of a kind of a slightly more mature organization?
I would say that we do hire entry-level folks. For instance, we do have a summer internship program now, right? So we do hire straight out of school. And I think that was part of just around the size of the organization, right? Like, do you have enough product managers where you can actually mentor somebody who's more junior? But that said, to your question, Tor, is I think we do still ideally look for expertise, but obviously it's less so. But like, if somebody studied robotics or machine learning, right? Like that's a leg up in terms of them hitting the ground running. But we do, I think, have more of a mix of seniority than we did early on, right? Early on, I just felt like the brand of your product organization is represented by every single PM. Like, a single mishire, kind of shapes how the engineering org or the rest of the org perceives the product org. So you have to kind of walk more on eggshells earlier on, I think, in the life cycle of a product organization. Whereas later on, you've developed enough credibility where the reality is you're going to have some misfires, right, when you have hires. So I think that's what allowed us both the enabling mentorship, and then also in terms of having established a brand as an organization to hire more junior.
You mentioned about needing to do more qualitative research just because of the nature of the product meant that, it's not possible to just run an A/B test on, move fast and break things with people's lives. And you sort of talked about how that really revealed from the L2 to L4 decision. Are there other things you can share about just the power of qualitative research and insights that's generated, and perhaps for people who are trying and maybe working in other product disciplines where, running an A/B experiment isn't quite as easy, that, will be really helpful in terms of building a qual research organization?
I think one way one way that's been helpful for us, that I wouldn't say compensates, but is like another tool, if you don't have like billions of users that you can just run an experiment, is the depth that you go in terms of UXR, right? So for instance, when we had our early rider program in Phoenix, so this was our bringing members of the public into our cars and our service. We had a very hands-on approach in terms of user research. So we would literally like have our UX researchers like be like visiting their houses, getting to know them. And I think why that was useful is like it brought a richness to the UXR, right? Because if you don't have numbers, you can't have quantitative outcomes, then you really like understand even more of the nuances that you get from every ride or every rider. So for instance, like I think it was really interesting seeing the kind of mission passion and of some of the early riders. They were just super excited to be like part of the program, contributing to the technology, right? And that's something that you might not get those nuances if you don't have as much of a kind of a high touch approach. So I think that's one tool that we've used. That's one that comes to mind, right? In terms of, I think the core of your question was, if you can't have the massive numbers, what are other ways that you can kind of get some of those insights? I'll try to think of other ones, but that's one that comes to mind.
So there's another question that sort of somewhat relates to this that's coming on Slido, I think is interesting. And the question is, how agile can you be when you're building a product that can literally crash if it goes wrong?
That's a great question. And I think that's part of what has made Waymo as successful as it is so far, right? In terms of us being able to deploy that is, you have to be able to solve that problem, right? And I think that's been early on, Waymo really recognized that building out a very robust simulation architecture was going to be necessary. And so very early on, we invested heavily in simulation. And so that's what allows us to go stick with regular releases, both on regular. And then the other part is having an incredible operations team that can also, because we have different levels, right? Like we do a lot of testing on the code, even when just after you check in, then it's like on the overall release. And then it's also when you deploy it, we first often deploy the software with an autonomous specialist. So you kind of build in these checks and balances, I think, through the release process. That's been really critical to allow us to still get to that velocity and that that development speed that we really need to.
So next up, if we jump in with some more of these Slido questions, so a little bit of a tangent now, but going back to a little bit what you were saying at the start, where Waymo obviously at the start didn't have product managers involved. What are your thoughts on a very early stage startup and whether it should have resources dedicated to product management when it's starting out?
So I'll give you a biased answer, right? I wouldn't suspect any of us would, but I do think it's important to have products involved early on. I think there's a few reasons for that, right? Because I think when you're coming up with the strategy, right, and where you want to go and the customers that you want to serve, it's really important, right? Those are critical questions for a survival of a tech company. And I do think that's kind of like what we're all passionate about here, right? And so I think it's important to bring in early on. I just think it often isn't brought in early on, and then you have to try to create that culture. But to me, I think the healthiest thing is recognizing the critical elements of a tech company, the engineering side, the product management side, these elements, and bringing them relatively early on, especially when you're trying to make sure you're hitting the right market, creating the right product. To me, those are all core product questions. So I would say that it's highly recommended to bring in product very early on.
Cool. There's another great question actually from Maxwell Reese. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, which is another just kind of, I think this is a slight curveball question, but I think it's really interesting, Dan. So not to make you sweat, but if autonomous driving was perfectly safe, what would the biggest challenge remaining be?
So I do think that there's questions around public acceptance. We definitely see that in polls of the general public where they're uncertain about the technology. I think there's also questions around regulatory, right, and regulations. That right now we exist in a world where there's a patchwork of regulations. Every country, every state really has different perspectives. And so assuming that we had kind of finished the technologies perfect, it can go anywhere, I would say those are probably the two biggest blockers. And I think on the public acceptance side, maybe I'll hopefully jump to the extra credit question, which is like, how do you resolve some of that? Would be, I do think it's natural for people to be skeptical of new technology, especially when it has life or death implications. And so that's why I think we've taken a very incremental approach. And we've been like kind of a city at a time, like increasing scale slightly at a time, releasing safety papers. So for instance, we released a safety paper talking about our safety methodologies and our safety data, and how like even when we simulated many of the fatal crashes, basically all the fatal crashes in that area that we drove in, we would have been mitigated if Waymo Driver had been part of that. So I think we need to build trust. I think the other element is showing them an amazing product, right? I think we find in our user research, or even in terms of our launched a program, is you quickly change a skeptic to an evangelist within a few seconds if you can actually show them an amazing fully autonomous car. So I think those are some of the elements we're trying on the public acceptance side, but I definitely think, you know, the world probably isn't ready for instantaneous, you know, autonomous cars everywhere yet. And the regulatory side, we've taken a very collaborative approach with, you know, state, local, federal regulators. We want them to know what we're doing. We want them to be educated. We want to partner with them. So we've taken very much a collaborative approach. So those are the things we're trying to mitigate. But if I had to answer the question around if we had instant L5 technology, you know, what would hold it back? I think those are the two that would come to mind.
I think that, yeah, if I can jump in as well, because I think that's a nice segue into what would a world with L5 technology actually look like? You know, people talk about the kind of second and even third, fourth order effects of autonomous vehicle technology, and as someone, you know, right at the heart of that space, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts about kind of some of the perhaps more obvious stuff that may happen if we can get to that point, but also maybe some of the things that people won't have considered that could change if we get to L5 anytime soon. And I mean, you know, we're not too well. Are we too far off? I don't know.
Well, I think we've made amazing strides. You know, hopefully, if people agree. Like, I think most people wouldn't have expected there'd be a live ride-hailing service where there'd be nobody at the wheel, and so I think that's been exciting. But to your question, yeah, I think that's part of what, you know, really gets people excited at Waymo is just the social impact that can come from our product. It does start with the obvious, right? Like, safety really is at the core of everything we do. And I think the focus of the organization is if we can make every single mile that is driven safer. So to save those 1.35 million lives, to save even the millions that are lead to injuries, to make the roads safer for pedestrians and cyclists, like that's really at the core of our focus. But to your point, I do think there's amazing second order effects that we're also really excited about as well, right? So the second one is we touched on it earlier, is mobility, right? When we think about, I think we often take mobility for granted for those of us who can drive. And there's just millions of folks that don't have access to a driver's license. And I think that both has dramatic impacts in terms of like loneliness, social connection, economic, you know, access to jobs and things like that. So I think that's another second order impact that we're really excited about and want to help with. And I think the last one that is also, I think, really interesting is how can we make the environment in our cities a better place? So for instance, right now, all of our ride-hailing vehicles are either hybrid or electric vehicles. And so when you look at kind of consumer preferences, right, the purchases of EVs still are a very small percentage of cars. Whereas if we can accelerate that through our ride-hailing service, that can have dramatic environmental benefits. And then I think even in terms of what our cities look like, right? So if you look at, sorry, so many of the data points are US centric, but like if we look at like an average city, right, like a lot of the urban core is still dedicated to parking lots. So one mind-blowing stat that I'd heard in the past that I often use is in the United States, when you take all the parking lots in the urban cores and add them together, it's around the size of an entire state in the United States. So imagine, right, a world where, you know, millions of lives are saved and we can feel like the roads are safe, right? Like how often when you're walking, you're kind of just like, ugh, like I'm not sure if that person's paying attention. Imagine everyone has access to mobility. Everyone can get where they want to go. And imagine an environment where the air is cleaner and the cities are really meant for us. Those are some of the impacts that I'm excited about.
Yeah, massively. Just one quick follow-up, because you talked a lot about kind of in our cities, and Exeter is a city, but it's certainly on the small end of the spectrum. Is autonomous vehicle and the ride hailing that Waymo is doing fundamentally an urban like solution? Like, and is there an economic impact then to the fact that does it become less viable if you are living more rurally, or actually do you think it will scale really nicely into rural communities as well, where there just isn't as much, you know, density and car usage? Well, lots of car usage, but you know, much more spread.
I might split that question into two, right? Like, I think one way to answer it is ride hailing more like urban focused? And I think the answer to that is yes, for today, it is, right? Like that's where more of the usage is. Like in the more suburban or rural areas, people tend to have their own cars, and that tends to be a better product for them. That said, on the ride hailing side, I think it remains to be seen, right? When there are differences in costs and availability and flexibility, whether that changes. But I think the second part of the question is, does autonomous technology apply kind of across these areas? And I think it absolutely does, right? So for instance, even today, in terms of our service in Phoenix, we find incredible passionate users and arguably kind of a more suburban area, right? And folks are parents, they're basically feeling like chauffeurs, taking their kids to various places, right? It's like there actually is a lot of usage of vehicles in those areas. It's just a question of, is a personally owned vehicle more convenient, right? Or is a shared mobility vehicle more convenient? And I think there's ways to make that better, right? I think, frankly, in a suburban environment, many of us, at least I can speak to myself, it's less convenient sometimes to use it, right? Because you've got parking lots, you've got, you need your car seats. And so I think there are elements that we can improve on, but fundamentally, I do think autonomous technology applies to everyone, right? Like the goal would be for every mile to be safer, because fundamentally the safety risk comes from the driver, right? The human driver. That's what leads to the safety risk.
So one last question on second order effects, because I think this is really interesting. It's interesting. This is a rare occasion where you're witnessing a disruptive technology evolve in front of you, and you kind of, you can recognize it as being clearly disruptive, clearly kind of life-changing in many ways. And historically, when these sort of disruptive technologies have landed in the public consciousness, people tend to, understandably, focus at first on what they stand to lose, but are not necessarily that adept at anticipating what new opportunities will be created. And so, for example, I can imagine people saying, well, a lot of people are employed in the delivery sector or in trucking or something like that, but are not necessarily seeing what new opportunities might open up for people and for in employment and in other ways. Is that something that you think about? And do you have any kind of thoughts on kind of what the future might hold that we haven't necessarily recognized as new opportunities?
Yeah, no, we definitely have thought about it. I think it's important, right? So as product managers, I think we all have the obligation to both look at the positive impacts as well as potentially, second order effects that we want to mitigate. So I think we do need to look at our products holistically. And so, yes, I think that's a question that comes up, right? Is what are some of the potentially negative impacts of autonomous technology? And I think I like how you put it, Tora, right? Like to me, it's around one, let's take it incrementally so people can see the positive impacts that are going to play out, I think, even sooner than they see some of the changes in the environment. I think the second one is realizing things that are some of the positive outputs. So for instance, like the job creation, right? Like there are new categories of jobs that are being created, right? Like a LiDAR technician, right, is a job that would have never existed before, right? And for instance, in our footprints in the various cities that we're deployed in, we're actually being able to build up, right, and hire locally for many of these new positions that never existed before. So I think those are some of the ways we look at. Like, one, we always want to look at it holistically and make sure that our positive impacts are more. And I think that's why we've often taken an incremental approach, because we want people to see that and feel comfortable with it. And then third is, yeah, we want to be part of that creation that mitigates some of those impacts.
So speaking of kind of a more positive outlook and positive kind of repercussions to what you're doing, one of the questions on Slido is, as PMs, we're taught to rely on data and research rather than opinions, but how do you handle ethical questions where there may not be a right answer?
Yeah, I think some of the work in terms of the safety papers and safety methodologies are been some of the most challenging and interesting conversations and debates that we've had to have at Waymo, and I think in terms of technology itself. Agree that there's no clear right answer, right? And so I think that requires us to build on our intuition and what we think is right. And I think that's been a big part of that conversation. So it's definitely right. And I think the other part is, how can we still leverage data in those contexts? So for instance, if you look at our safety papers, we do a lot of analysis, right, around the miles that we've driven, how safe those miles have been. So I think while there's no one right answer or where the bar is just set for you, I do think making sure you have the right metrics and the right data for you still is assistive in that conversation. But I think it does come down to that is the environment. You have to also create the right environment where people can have those conversations freely, right? And I think that's the other element, is creating the governance, the right metrics, and also the right culture that you can have that conversation. And I think for us at Waymo, we've basically emphasized safety really being at the core of what we do, and that allows us to still kind of move quickly as an organization, but recognizing that we won't compromise that foundation. So I think that was the other part that's been important to those conversations.
So I'm curious. I'm sure I know when we were talking before, when we were kind of prepping for this, we were talking about kind of what are the questions that you often get asked, and I'm sure one question that comes up a lot, and it's a question that's come up in the YouTube comments, is, when are you going to launch in additional locations? And I'm sure if you hadn't answered that question, it would be in the public domain by now. But to take a spin on that, I'm curious, how do you go about selecting locations? What are the factors that would influence your choices? Like, why Phoenix first? Why San Francisco second? And so on. And perhaps that might give us a bit of an insight into where you might end up going in future without necessarily expecting you to commit to anything.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we look at cities, we look at a kind of a multifaceted view of the cities, right? So we do look at kind of how attractive the market is, like both in terms of number of miles driven, as well as in terms of the ride-hailing markets. So that's one element. Two, we do look at it from a regulatory point of view, right? Like where are the locations where they want to partner with us, they want to work with us. And then I think we also look at what are the technical complexities that the various cities offer. And so to your question, I think Phoenix was very interesting to us early on for a few reasons. One is it's, I think, one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. I think it's number 5 already. Yet it allowed us to focus on certain elements of the autonomous driving, right? Rather than focus on, snow and rain right now, we really wanted to focus on the core Waymo driver. And I think that that allowed us to focus on it. And actually, because the critical question, I think, at that time was, is L4 even possible? Is that even, a pipe dream, or is it something that's a reality? And I think that's why Phoenix was so important for us to get to that proof point. So I think those are some of the elements, right? Like, is the business opportunity, the technical challenges, And we want to get to a mix, right? Because if you look at urban environments, it has a certain mix, right? It has more pedestrians and more narrow streets. But then if you actually look in areas like Phoenix, you actually have higher speed roads. You have unprotected turns. So to really truly build a generalizable Waymo driver, you need a mix of environments. You can't just have one, because ultimately our goal, right, is for it to be deployed in multiple environments in many cities.
Fantastic. We've probably got time for one or two more questions. So if you're sitting wondering whether or not to ask, now is the time to just go for it and ask. I don't know if Hannah or Tor, you've got other follow-up questions, or we'll go back to Slido. But
well, I have one actually, which is I think we talked early on about how Waymo was sort of spun out of early autonomous driving research that happened at Google, and presumably, tell me if I'm wrong, benefited in those early days from access to Google technology, or at least access, for example, to Google's mapping data in order to have a model of the world in which to, as you say, build simulators and so forth. What do you think the barriers to entry are for new companies in this space right now? Is it something that startups can get involved in, and how might they do that?
Yeah, I think that the answer to that question is evolved over time, I would say, right? Like, if you look at the kind of hype cycle for autonomous cars, right? Like, I think for a while it was like, this is crazy, only Waymo is doing it, right? And then the next cycle was, oh yeah, this is obvious, everyone can do it, right? I really feel like there's a period where there was, somebody in their garage, doing an autonomous car left and right. And I think what we've seen over the last year is, I do think that it takes a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of investment to get to autonomous technology is what we've seen over the market over the last year or two, right? So we're definitely moving out of the phase of dozens of startups, and very much I think everyone needs to either have access to significant resources, because everything from having the operations or having the significant engineering investment to build the Waymo driver, or even in terms of the simulation technology, all of those really are pretty significant. So I think the answer is, I do think this is not going to be the type of technology that you're going to have like hundreds of people that get to the finish line. That said, I do think that startups are finding a way of taking pieces of the value chain and trying to offer value. And so that probably is a more realistic approach for smaller companies, is finding pieces that maybe are less entwined with the full integrated solution. I think there's still questions around whether that works, right? So for instance, right, like we know that there are startups that are doing like different pieces. Like Waymo mostly is held to kind of a fully integrated approach. And I think that's one of the things that sets us apart, because we realized early on that many of the things on the market didn't offer the capabilities we needed. We're always reassessing that and open to that, but I think also the integration allows us to really move faster, right? So owning that full stack. But I think that's the approach probably for startups, is to find pieces in the value chain that might offer value. And I think some have been successful at that. I do think that the full-on solution space is going to be left for companies with much deeper resources.
And on that note, I think just for anybody who's interested in this space and watching it more generally, are there any other kind of companies or organizations that you would recommend watching, like you think are doing interesting things, or a kind of taking an unusual or creative approach to this, or building new businesses on top of this technology? Anybody you would sort of recommend us keeping an eye on?
I don't know if particular names come to mind, but like maybe building off the last question, I do think it's interesting looking at some of the startups that are trying to offer value-add services for some of these areas. And I think the key question is whether those services need to be too integrated, right, with the ultimate solution that it's hard to outsource and hard to kind of go to a third party, or they can truly be agnostic. And I think if they can prove that out, that it can be more agnostic, I think that's an interesting space. Just that's one thing that would come to mind.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I think we are all out of time.
I think we are, yeah. Obviously, well, one quick question, Dan. If people want to follow stuff that Waymo is doing, that's probably fairly obvious. But do you blog anywhere? Do you tweet anywhere that people could follow you, perhaps? Or is it best to just go to Waymo and follow along there?
I would say that I'm not. I haven't been super active when it comes to social media, etc. But yeah, we do have a Waymo blog, and that's probably the best way to follow some of Waymo's announcements. And I'll see if I can ever get into the social media stuff.
Good for you. Well, massive thanks to Dan for coming. We really appreciate you giving up your time. You've got a busy day ahead of you, I'm sure, because you're on the West Coast. So thank you. It's worth just giving a final thank you as well to our sponsor, Nexus Mods. If you are looking for a job in gaming, product management role in gaming, they are definitely one to check out. So please do go and check out Nexus Mods. This has all been recorded, so you can watch this on YouTube at any time. And if you want to share this with other people, we would love you to do that, and hopefully they find it useful. Are we doing another event soon? Rhetorical question.
I'm sure we probably are.
Yeah, non-committal answer. Yeah, yes. No, for those people based in and around Exeter, we are looking to do our first in-person event sometime fairly soon. So please do keep your eyes peeled for that. Rumor has it.
Not our first in-person event.
Sorry, our first post-COVID.
First in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, rumor has it Tor may even grace us with his presence from further east along the south coast. Excellent. So yeah, hope to see you there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much.